day Judge Elizabeth Scherer stood up from the bench, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. There was no shouting, no dramatic pause, just a sentence delivered with calm finality. One that buried a man for life. The defendant will not be getting out of prison. Ever. No parole. No possibility of release. No hope. Nikolas Cruz, the young man responsible for one of the deadliest school shootings in American history, was sentenced to life in prison for every life he took on the 14th of February, 2018, at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. But before that final judgment came nearly 5 years of grief, outrage, and agonizing delays for dozens of families. It took months of investigation, brutal testimony, and legal warfare to bring the case to a close. And yet, even with all the evidence, all the trauma, and all the voices crying out for justice, a death sentence never came. Why not? This trial wasn't just about a murderer. It was about the cracks in a system that saw the red flags and failed to act. A system where a troubled teen with a known history of violence, mental instability, and threats was still able to walk into a school with a legally purchased AR-15. This courtroom didn't just deliver justice, it exposed it. It became a battleground for education policy, mental health reform, gun control laws, and the fundamental question of how far mercy should reach in the shadow of unimaginable violence. So, who was Nikolas Cruz, really? Why did he choose Valentine's Day to strike? What did the families of the victims say in court? And why did the jury stop short of issuing the ultimate penalty? I invite you to follow this case from the inside, with the eyes of a detective and the clarity of a legal analyst, as we peel back the layers of one of the most painful chapters in recent American memory. Because sometimes, justice doesn't scream. Sometimes, it whispers from behind a locked prison door. Nikolas Cruz was born in 1998 and adopted at a young age by Linda and Roger Cruz, a couple living in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in Parkland, Florida, a place where tragedy always seemed like something that happened elsewhere. Roger passed away early, leaving Linda to raise Nikolas and his adopted younger brother alone. Friends described her as loving but overwhelmed. As Nikolas grew older, troubling behaviors began to emerge. He was violent toward animals, destroyed property, obsessed over weapons, and struggled to form lasting relationships at school. Students whispered about him. The weird kid who brags about guns, they said. Teachers raised concerns, reporting disturbing drawings, aggressive language, and threatening behavior. But time after time, the red flags were brushed aside. The school system failed to build a coordinated response between educators, mental health professionals, and law enforcement. In February 2017, just 1 year before the tragedy, Nikolas Cruz was officially expelled from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School due to behavioral and disciplinary concerns. He drifted in the months that followed, slipping further into isolation. On social media, he posted ominous warnings. "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." The FBI received this tip. So did local police. But the information got lost, misfiled, misunderstood, or simply ignored. A system meant to detect threats did exactly the opposite. In November 2017, Cruz's adoptive mother, Linda, died suddenly of pneumonia. With her gone, Nikolas was left completely unmoored. He bounced between homes, increasingly volatile and unstable. Somewhere in those final weeks, he legally purchased an AR-15-style rifle, despite a documented history of mental and behavioral issues. No one intervened. No one followed up. And so, on Valentine's Day, 2018, Nikolas Cruz walked back into the school that had cast him out not as a student, but as the harbinger of devastation. The 14th of February, 2018. At Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, students were celebrating Valentine's Day with balloons, cards, and whispered teenage confessions of love. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary day. Until it wasn't. At approximately 2:19 p.m., Nikolas Cruz arrived at the school. He wore a black trench coat, carried a duffel bag, and moved with chilling intent. Inside the bag, a legally purchased AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, and a backpack loaded with loaded magazines. Surveillance footage later captured his entrance quiet, methodical, like a shadow passing through an unsuspecting hallway. In just under 6 minutes, Cruz moved floor by floor through Building 12, firing indiscriminately. Classrooms turned into war zones. Students hid beneath desks, behind cabinets, some playing dead. Teachers risked their lives to shield students. Some succeeded, others never made it out. By the end of the rampage, 17 people were dead, 14 students and 3 staff members. 17 others were wounded. Among the victims were heroes: a football coach who used his body as a shield, a geography teacher who tried to lock the door, and a student who died while protecting a friend. And then, Cruz vanished. He removed his vest, blended into the crowd of fleeing students, and quietly walked off campus. He was apprehended over an hour later in a nearby neighborhood, without resistance. His first words to police: "I'm the one who did it." But what investigators would uncover in the days ahead was even more unsettling. Cruz had planned the attack. He had mapped it out. He had brought a Gatorade with him to hydrate afterward. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a mission. The Parkland shooting became a national trauma not only because of its brutality, but because it seemed preventable. This was not a mystery. Nikolas Cruz had been flagged, warned about, expelled, and still he had been able to buy a military-style weapon and return to the place that feared him most. When Nikolas Cruz was taken into custody, law enforcement agencies at every level, local, state, federal, mobilized not only to understand his actions, but to answer an urgent question: how did this happen? The deeper they dug, the more chilling the answer became. Cruz wasn't an unknown entity. In fact, from 2010 to 2018, the Broward County Sheriff's Office received at least 45 calls related to his household, many involving violence, threats, or mental health concerns. Time after time, authorities were warned about his behavior, but nothing was done. More alarmingly, the FBI had received 2 tips specifically naming Nikolas Cruz. One of them came just a month before the shooting, from someone close to him who described him as armed, unstable, and dangerous, and explicitly warned that he might explode. The information was never passed to the Miami field office. It fell through the cracks. At school, the pattern was just as troubling. Teachers and administrators had filed reports, flagged Cruz for disturbing drawings, aggressive speech, and threats. He had been recommended for mental health evaluation, but there was no consistent follow-up, no coordinated monitoring, and no real intervention. Meanwhile, Cruz, at age 18, legally purchased the AR-15 used in the shooting. In Florida at the time, no mental health screening was required, and red flag laws were weak or non-existent. Even though his behavior had been well documented, nothing prevented him from arming himself. The investigation also uncovered a failure of security at the school itself. During the attack, an armed school resource officer stationed on campus chose not to engage, instead retreating and radioing for backup. His inaction became a national scandal, adding fuel to the fire of public outrage. In the aftermath, the official conclusion was blunt. The Parkland shooting could have been prevented, but it wasn't not because the system didn't exist, but because it failed at nearly every level to connect the dots. The result? 17 dead, and a nation asking itself whether never again meant anything at all. What happened in the courtroom and why the death penalty was taken off the table would become the next national shock. The trial of Nikolas Cruz began in 2022 and lasted for months, not because his guilt was in question, but because in Florida, even with a guilty plea, a full sentencing trial is required when prosecutors seek the death penalty. This was not a whodunit. It was a confrontation between law, trauma, and morality. The prosecution laid out the horror in excruciating detail. They played surveillance footage, 911 calls, text messages sent in panic. They recited the names of the victims not just once, but over and over, ensuring no one could forget. The aim was clear: to prove that this act was not just heinous, but premeditated and deserving of the harshest punishment allowed by law. Then came the parents. They stood in court and looked directly at the young man who had stolen their children. Their voices shook. Some could barely get the words out. One father cried, "Every morning, I wake up hoping my daughter is still alive, but she's not. And he is. He gets to eat. He gets to sleep. My child is gone." In response, the defense didn't deny the pain. Instead, they painted a picture of a life marred from the very beginning. Cruz's lawyers argued that he had been exposed to drugs in utero, that his biological mother was addicted to crack cocaine, that he suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome, developmental delays, and untreated psychiatric disorders for most of his life. They pleaded for mercy, not for who Cruz became, but for the child who never had a chance. The prosecution pushed back hard. Childhood trauma, they said, is not an excuse for mass murder. The courtroom was tense throughout. Some parents left during graphic evidence. Others sat stone-faced. But all of them waited for one thing: a death sentence. Instead, they got a split decision. Florida law requires a unanimous jury decision for capital punishment. And after weeks of testimony, just 1 or 2 jurors held out, citing Cruz's mental health history as a mitigating factor. That was enough. No death penalty. The reaction was immediate and furious. Parents sobbed. Some collapsed. Others screamed in disbelief. One mother said through tears, "He murdered my daughter, and the system just gave him life." And so the weight of judgment fell not just on the killer, but on the system once again, a system that had now failed the victims not once, but twice. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Rows of grieving parents, teachers, friends, and survivors filled every seat. Some clutched photographs. Others just stared. At the front sat Nikolas Cruz, head shaved, hands folded, eyes downcast. Judge Elizabeth Scherer, known for her firm and composed demeanor throughout the trial, addressed the court with deliberate calm. And then she delivered what would become one of the most memorable rulings in modern courtroom history. "You will not leave prison. Not in 10 years. Not in 20. Not ever." Cruz received 17 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each person he killed, along with 17 additional sentences for the wounded, all to be served consecutively. No parole. No early release. No future. Then came the impact statements, raw, emotional, and unrelenting. One father stood and said, "Every breath you take in prison is one my daughter can't take. Every sunrise you see is one she never will." Another mother described hearing her child's voice over the phone in the final seconds, her last words cut short by the sound of gunfire. Cruz remained silent throughout, occasionally nodding, occasionally fidgeting. Some thought he looked remorseful. Others said he looked empty. But no one forgave him. No one in that room ever would. Judge Scherer concluded the hearing with a final act of quiet defiance, not just legal, but symbolic. "I will not speak the defendant's name again," she said. "From today forward, he will not be known. He does not deserve the dignity of identity." And with that, the gavel fell. Cruz was led out in shackles. No one looked back. Justice had been served as much as it could be. But the pain, the loss, the broken families, that sentence, for them, would never end. Nikolas Cruz was transferred to a maximum security prison, where he will live out the rest of his days in silence, isolation, and routine. No parole, no future, no name spoken. But outside those walls, the case never really ended. Across the country, protests erupted, not just about the sentence, but about everything that led to it, and everything that hadn't changed since. How could a young man with so many red flags, so many warnings, so many chances to be stopped, still walk into a school and commit unspeakable violence? For many, the sentence felt hollow. They wanted more. Not just punishment, but prevention. Some saw the lack of a death penalty as a moral failure. Others saw it as a human rights decision, but all agreed. The system had failed. Parents who lost children in Parkland became activists, speaking before Congress, launching foundations, demanding reforms. They pushed for new laws on gun control, mental health intervention, and school security. Some succeeded. In 2018, Florida passed the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Act, which raised the minimum age to buy rifles and funded armed guards at schools. But those changes came after the funerals, after the trauma, after the headlines faded, And still, across the country, thousands of schools remained vulnerable. Thousands of troubled teens slipped through the cracks. The Parkland case became a symbol not of justice, but of what happens when warnings are ignored. For the families, the grief is lifelong. Every birthday, every graduation that will never happen, is a reminder of what was stolen. They live with absence. They speak for children who no longer can. Their fight is not just for closure, it's for a future where no one else has to endure what they did. Because justice, in this case, wasn't just about locking someone up. It was about asking a nation, what did we miss? What will we miss next time? And how many more names will we have to read before we finally change?